Hello and welcome to this webinar on grant fraud. This is presented as part of the Charity Fraud Awareness Week. And as you know, Charity Fraud Awareness Week brings together everyone involved in the charity and non-profit sector to raise awareness and share good practice in tackling fraud and financial crime. We encourage you to share this webinar and any resources with your colleagues. If you join us live, we also encourage you to ask questions through the webinar, and these can be submitted using the Q&A box on screen. We will try to answer these questions towards the end of the session. If we don't get time for all of them, we will try to take them away and obtain answers where we can. So let's kick off. So again, welcome. I'm really pleased you've all joined us today. We've got some great speakers for you later on. I'll introduce them shortly, and I hope you're going to enjoy the session. I'm sure you'll all agree Charity Fraud Awareness Week is very important. And it's great that it's been running for a number of years now. Obviously this week we're exactly halfway through Charity Fraud Awareness Week, with it being midday on a Wednesday. So I hope you've enjoyed all of the webinars and all the content that we've had previously. I for one have certainly enjoyed a lot of the webinars, and a lot of the information has been provided. There's been some excellent insights, particularly into the changing world of fraud. And that brings us nicely onto grant fraud. As we know, a lot of charities rely on grants, and these grants are becoming less, unfortunately, due to what's happened with the recent pandemic. And quite rightly, in my opinion, there's a lot more scrutiny on grants and on how they're spent, how they're used, and who receives those grants. And our donors are putting a lot more scrutiny on us. And I think that's right, and that should be throughout the whole part of a grant, not just at the start when we're applying, but also how it's spent, how it's used, and ultimately how fraud is prevented, so the funds are not lost. So as I said today, we've got some great speakers. Just a very quick introduction about myself. So my name's Daniel Helps. I'm the Global Deputy Head of Counter Fraud at the British Council. I'm not an expert on grant fraud myself. However, we have had grant fraud within the British Council. My expertise is in actual investigations, having worked in the arena since 2000 for various government agencies, etc. But today is not about me, so I won't keep talking about myself. As I said, we've got some excellent speakers today who are real experts in the grant area. So I'm just going to introduce them for you quickly, and then we'll move on to their presentations. So firstly, we have Stuart Goshawk, who is the CEO of the Wembley National Stadium Trust. Stuart has had a long career in charities and in the grant-making world, both in central and local government for almost 30 years, and has also worked as a principal grants officer at the City Bridge Trust and the head of secretariat at the London Bombing Relief Fund, which, as I'm sure we'll all realise, is an extremely important organisation. So Stuart will be talking to you as we go through. And we've also got Max Rutherford, who's the Head of Policy and Practice at the Association of Charitable Foundations. Obviously, the association is something that affects all of us, and I'm sure all charities work closely with the policies and the practice that Max's team put out. And then finally, we have Emma Rogers, who is the Grants Counter Fraud Lead at the Cabinet Office. And Emma is a counter fraud subject matter expert, leading the counter fraud team within governance and grant management within the Cabinet Office. So that being said, I'm going to move on. Just quickly, so you know, as we go through, not all of our speakers will have slides. So if you don't see the slides pop up, don't worry, you're not missing anything. So only towards the end, Max is the only one with slides. So don't worry if Stuart doesn't have any, and if Emma doesn't have any. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Emma.
Great, thanks, Daniel. So I'm going to kick this off with a story. I'm going to tell you a story about a man called Alex. Alex sent us an email last year using the grants misuse mailbox to report a fraud. He'd been claiming for an ongoing grant, and his friend had been helping him with the grant application paperwork that had hit financial difficulties and run off with the most recent payment. Alex was understandably very upset and reported it to the Cabinet Office as impersonation fraud, which is absolutely something we're interested in. What Alex hadn't realised is that in his email, he'd made it very clear that his current address is and had been for a while in Romania, making him ineligible for all of the grant funding he'd received. It appears Alex quickly realised his mistake and sent another email reassuring us that his friend had agreed to pay the money to him and that the case can be dropped, but needless to say, it wasn't. Unfortunately, not all fraudsters email us to tell us they're committing fraud, so my team exists to help schemes and departments find where fraud's happening in their grants. And fraud's not new. Fraud in grants has been around since way before the pandemic, since before the EU referendum, probably before the World Cup '96 even. Fraudsters will have been trying to abuse grant schemes for as long as grants have been around. But now fraud is in the headlines on a regular basis. Now ministers are taking notice and actively talking about fraud. And now the public are more aware than ever and expect us as government and charities to be doing something about it. Now we have momentum to make real change. And when we talk about fraud, we're talking about a person dishonestly making a false representation, failing to disclose information, or abusing their position with the intention of making a gain for themselves or another, or causing a loss to another. And it's important to understand that the gain or loss doesn't have to succeed in order for a fraud or an offence to be committed, so long as the intent is there. So the difference between fraud and error is dishonesty. Fraud is deliberate. It's not an accident or a system error. A fraudster's intent is personal gain, which undermines the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So I started working with Cabinet Office a couple of years ago, and I'll be honest, the first time I stepped into the then FCDO building to do a fraud risk assessment, I didn't really know much about grants at all. I sat in the meeting working through the different risks and controls and thinking to myself, why on earth are we giving grants instead of having a procurement contract? From then, I started learning the power that grants have as a tool for economic well-being, equality, and innovation. And through the pandemic, they've been vital to getting support quickly to those who need it most, our charitable partners being very high on that list. But there are people out there that don't share our objectives, who seek to gain grants that they're not entitled to. And it's easy to kind of think, oh, it's not in our organisation, but it's in fact individuals who commit fraud, and they could be anywhere. And COVID's really increased the risk. We've seen that a lot of people's personal circumstances has changed. Many people are under more financial pressure than they were before. There's been unprecedented grant spend providing more opportunity than ever to commit fraud. And it's in the headlines all the time. Everyone's doing it. It's only small, they'll never find it. It's become easier to justify. We've seen an increase in opportunistic fraud and serious organised crime. And these could be people who are applying for a grant that you're redistributing on behalf of government. They could be someone who's applying for the grant that you didn't get. And it could be someone within your own organisation. So being aware of fraud and actively tackling it is key. As government, we partner with charities who share our objectives to provide support and services to those who are most in need. And fraud undermines the shared outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and it's happening right now. So let's take a quick look at the numbers. Charity Commission published this week that charities lost 8.6 million to fraud last year as an estimate. And taking current estimates for 2019-20, fraud in grants is expected to be around £500 million to £5.9 billion. COVID's increased that risk. And we know that fraud's a hidden crime, so both of those are very conservative figures. Fraud is also the most common crime in the UK, and all 17 of our grant-making departments has a level of fraud risk. Fraud is a very real risk, and we're looking at a holistic approach to tackling it, working out how we can collaborate across government, internationally, with our partners and grant recipients to protect grant spend. And our efforts have only increased to respond to the challenge that COVID-19 has brought. Firstly, we are actively looking for fraud. We're applying post-award controls and assurance to find where fraud and error may have occurred and clawing back where that's appropriate. We're using the learnings to embed preventative measures into policy advice and fundamentally into grant scheme design, so these frauds are stopped before they happen in future. We're making sure our grant schemes have the right resources to deliver grants effectively through training, guidance, policy, direct support. And it'll be no surprise that capacity has been a challenge this year. So we're investing heavily in digital tools to prevent and detect fraud and error. This speeds up the process, means we have more coverage and can find more fraud. It also means we're really modernising grant making. We're currently working on a number of data pilots to join up across government, and many of the data sets we're using for the first time ever. And it's important that we're sharing our learnings and have a way to connect and discuss. So we're setting up working groups and connecting across government, looking at how we partner with external professional organisations such as ICAEW as well. So you'll recognise that we're taking the learnings from COVID-19 and embedding them into our pre-award process, because it's much easier to prevent fraud than it is to remediate it. We're working to put in place the right resources and controls to deliver grants effectively so that our end recipients get the funding they rely on. But we can't do it without your help. We're looking to our charity partners to share the message that fraud is a crime. As a charity, you can also actively look for fraud through the use of fraud risk assessments, so you know where those risks are, and targeted testing, so that you're actually actively kind of looking at those top risks. And there are preventative and detective controls that you can use, as well as discussing fraud with your assurance providers. And of course, if you see or suspect fraud, report it to your grant department, to Action Fraud, or to Crime Stoppers. Fraud is a reality of the world that we live in, and finding it in your organisation is a really good thing. It means you've recognised the risk, you've got the right processes and controls in place to protect your funding. We have a joint responsibility between government and charities to make sure grants are spent in the right way, and we've got huge potential to harness that partnership for the greater good. Together, we can take action against fraud in grants, so funding is used to support the people who need it most. I'll now pass over to Stuart to talk through the practical experiences of a grant maker during the pandemic.
Thanks, Emma. The introductory slide said I'm Chief Executive of the Wembley National Stadium Trust, which is my usual day job, but I want to draw on the experience of the London Community Response Fund, which has been run by City Bridge Trust, the charity of the City of London Corporation over the pandemic period. And that has been a pooled fund of contributions for around 20 funders. So not just City Bridge Trust's own money, but other trusts and foundations, corporate funders, and the like. So the responsibility was significant to make sure that all of those contributions were used to their best effect. And we, as Emma said, we know that the fraudsters are out there, and it's our responsibility to make sure that we do as much as we can to ensure that they don't get over our castle walls. My theory is always that we build our walls 10 meters high so the fraudster will buy a 12-meter ladder. So we build our walls 15 meters high so they buy an 18-meter ladder, and on it goes. But the London Community Response Fund was launched in April 2020 at the very start of the pandemic, and it was intended to be a very quick, a very not easy, but a much more straightforward, streamlined means of frontline charities accessing funds from across a range of trusts and foundations. And just so you're aware, across the year April 20 to April 21, over 5 waves of grant making, we distributed £31.4 million in over nearly 1,700 grants. So you can see the volume and the speed that we were getting that money out. And a lot of it was done on desk assessment rather than usual assessment visits and stuff like. So I can hear you all, even though I can't actually hear you. Sort of the alarm bells ringing as to the potentials for fraud. And almost 2/3 of the groups that got money from the LCRF had never been funded by City Bridge Trust before. So again, we really had to make sure that our anti-fraud walls were as solid as they could be. And how did we do this? We wanted to make sure, obviously, organisations working at the front line were, they were right up against it in the pandemic. So we didn't want to put more and more administration on them just to get the money that they needed to provide those emergency services. So our mantra was that we wanted to put in a light touch, but not a soft touch. And that might sound a bit cliched, but that really was the way that we worked. And our way of working was that we wanted to use every tool in our box to make sure that we kept fraud to an absolute minimum, and that the vast majority of the grants that we gave went to properly constituted, known organisations doing that work on the front line. And so what we put in place was a whole series of steps within the sifting the award or the assessment, and then the award process, to make sure that at every stage there were checks and balances, and we were using the expertise of the whole system, the whole trust and foundation movement, to ensure that the knowledge we had was as broad as it could be. So we had a sifting group doing a first check on all of the applications that we received, not just checking, was it a registered charity? Is it on the Charity Commission? Is it on Companies House? Checking their website, checking phone numbers, doing everything we could to make sure that the organisation that was on screen in front of us was a valid organisation. And we had a panel of experienced expert grant assessors doing oversight of that whole process, and making sure that if anybody was unsure at any time, that they referred that case to that panel of expert assessors, make sure that what got through that first stage even was, as far as we could discern, a true and valid organisation. Then through the LCRF, we had a panel of, again, the best assessors that we could lay our hands on, and that panel changed over time as people come and go and people could free up. Obviously, they all had their own day jobs to do throughout the pandemic as well. So it was very much a case of who can we get to do this job at short notice, but with the most a deep professionalism that we could. And what we also did was make sure that we gave all of those assessors as much anti-fraud training as we could, some real practical tips. If they say they've got a website, the organisation, does it work? We asked for bank statements. Does it look like the bank statement's been tampered with? Does it look like a genuine document? Who are the auditors or the independent examiners doing the accounts? Are they, what you might see as a firm of, backstreet accountants, or are they a firm of accountants who we know? And some real sort of simple tips that we've just learnt from experience. That does the application form that we've received, does that have lots and lots of capital letters on it? Is it, and email addresses, are they just generic email addresses? And I was rather concerned that one of the tips put in the guidance we put together was that, is it a Yahoo email address or an AOL email address, or something very easy that anybody could just put together over the, in 30 seconds on a website? And it rather concerned me because my personal email address is an AOL email address. So does that mean I'm more likely to be a fraudster than maybe not? But again, we had, the real message there was do all of these checks. And if you're not sure, ask somebody else. Ask, come back to the centre and ask again. Because it's that old mantra, that if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then more than likely it is a duck. And over the years, I've done this for decades now. We've all had occasions where you've ummed and ahed, and do I make this grant? Do I not? I'm not sure. And if you're really not sure, that gut instinct says it's going to come back and bite you on the backside, and it nearly always does. So really, just make sure that you use your instincts and use all of the information that you've got available. The last stage that we did, we then had a multi-trust, multidisciplinary panel who actually looked through the assessments and then made the awards on the grants. So again, we're using as much knowledge and as much expertise as we can from all of the different participants we had within the scheme. So there was as much as we could to make sure that anybody who was trying to pull the wool over our eyes could be found out at one of those many stages of checks and balances. And then sort of once we'd awarded the grants, obviously they may be valid organisations, but they're not spending the money how we had asked them to do so. Clearly, in a pandemic situation, we know things changed, things moved, and that the goalposts, what they needed to do today, wouldn't necessarily be the same as how they needed to spend the money tomorrow. So we did take a very liberal attitude to how the money could be spent, but clearly we needed to make sure that it was being spent charitably and also on the purposes that any organisation can deliver within their own mem and arts. So we had a very straightforward monitoring system in place in each round for the grants that we made. again, making sure that it wasn't so onerous, as to be more work than actually getting receipt and receiving the grant and actually spending it. So we put thresholds in place to make sure that if there was £100 left over or whatever, that was acceptable. If we're talking, was there several £1,000s unspent, or several £1,000s spent not on what you'd originally said you were going to spend the grant on, then that needed to be reported. And then we also did some spot checks to make sure with phone calls, and obviously, and then the larger the grants, we did calls with organisations, we did video calls. Obviously, in the pandemic period, we couldn't actually get out and do visits, and monitoring visits, assessment visits, what we would normally have done. So we were as tight as we could be, whilst making sure that we actually put more burdens on the organisations at the time of their greatest need and their greatest stress. So that's how we proceeded. And again, happy to take any questions later about the experience that we had. And I'm going to hand over to Max.
Great, thanks very much, Stuart and Emma. So I've just got 2 slides which are going to help with the flow of my remarks this afternoon. Just to start really with ACF's take on tackling grant fraud. We last year produced a document which is freely available, and the link can be shared with delegates via the Preventing Grant Fraud website page for this event. I just want to start with talking you through some of the key points from that. So going back to some of the fundamentals when it comes to grant fraud in relation to charitable foundations, but I think it'd be relevant to any sorts of charitable organisations that is either awarding money to others or government entities that are awarding grants to other organisations. And then I'm going to move on to the second slide, which will look at some of the changing context around grant fraud, particularly in relation to charitable foundations, and potentially some changes that are on the horizon. So first of all, just to set out what we think grant fraud means from the context of the membership body for charitable foundations. So our members, 425 organisation members across the United Kingdom, who award between them about £3.5 billion a year in grants, mostly to other charities, and not exclusively, and that's something we might want to think about today. But they, importantly, are charities themselves. So they are part of civil society as well as major funders of it. So last year, with the help of counter-fraud expert Phil Sapey, we produced this guidance for foundations. And the purpose of the guide, for the purpose of ACF's guide, we consider grant fraud as the dishonest application or deliberate misuse of grant funding by an individual or organisation outside of the foundation. So of course, there are additional checks and procedures that must be thought about in terms of internal fraud for any organisation. But this guide is particularly about fraud using the foundation's money by others beyond the organisation, the foundation itself. Of course, grant fraud is just one type of fraud, and steps to prevent grant fraud should be part of a broader effort to counter other kinds of fraud. Earlier research before the production of this guide found that compared to other kinds of grant makers, such as statutory bodies, charitable foundations are particularly vulnerable to being victims of grant fraud due to a combination of being known to distribute funding and being seen as potentially quite benign charitable organisations. Why does grant fraud matter? It can, of course, divert resources from the aims of the organisation, meaning genuine beneficiaries get less support or go without. It can damage the reputation of the foundation, but it's vitally important to remember that trustees have the legal duty to look out for foundation funds, and I'll come back to the role of trustees shortly. Beyond regulatory compliance, active prevention against fraud ensures the foundation's resource, not only financial, but also time and capacity, are deployed to best effort in pursuit of the foundation's mission as a charity. It is important to say most grant applications, the vast majority, are honest. There are also occasional innocent mistakes made by completely trustworthy individuals and organisations. So what we're talking about, as others have said already, is the intentional, deliberate effort to conduct fraud. There are two principal places in the grant making process where grant fraud can occur. The first is the pre-award stage, when a person or organisation dishonestly misleads the foundation in the application process, either by not telling the whole truth, omission, or by telling a lie, commission. Secondly, grant fraud can occur post-award, when a person or organisation deliberately uses grant money for purposes other than that for which it was provided. This can be aggravated by the production of false accounts or false supporting evidence. Whose responsibility is it for tackling grant fraud? So in terms of our guidance, we recognise that it will usually be implemented by staff within foundations where a staff team exists, as it relates to assessing applications, carrying out due diligence, communicating with grantees. So typically that's done by a staff team or a staff member. However, ultimately, it's the essential duty of the trustees to manage the foundation's resources responsibly, including the risks that arise from grant fraud. Trustees are also vital in establishing a counter-fraud culture throughout the organisation, internally and externally. So what can trustees do to help minimise the risk of grant fraud? As volunteers meeting 4 or 5 times a year, how can they help prevent grant fraud? Many trustees won't be involved in the day-to-day management of grants. They won't likely hold the relationships with grantees, but it's important that the trustee board sets an appropriate tone about the foundation's counter-fraud stance. And one way to do this is by developing a counter-fraud policy. And if your foundation, those of you who work in foundations, have not specifically considered the risk of grant fraud before, this can often be helpful to start with a discussion about the trustee's attitude to risk more generally. Some trustees will feel that taking measured risks with grant funding is entirely appropriate, that the very role of a foundation is to fund projects or organisations that other funders would not or could not support, while other organisations, other trustees will be more risk averse. The balance in the end, as a charity, giving money to others is a matter of choice for the individual foundation concerned. And some of the factors that might influence the tone of your risk approach would include the aims of the foundation, the nature and areas of benefit of funding, the type of organisations or individuals you're looking to support, the size of the grants given and that sense of proportionality, the offer of other kind of support in addition to funding, such as peer support, Funder Plus type support, the level of staff resource which you can actually dedicate to monitoring a grant, and the geographical area served. Is it UK based, and if so, where in the UK, or is it outside of the UK, and therefore what additional considerations might you need to take for other jurisdictions? And then once you've considered the appropriate level of risk for your foundation, a counter-fraud policy and fraud response plan can then be developed. So just lastly on this slide, what are the key elements of preventing grant fraud? And Stuart and Emma have already talked through some of these, but from our point of view, it's really important this is seen as fraud prevention as part of due diligence more widely. And this would include pre-application or during the application stage visits where possible, looking at other platforms such as 360 Giving. Are these organisations appearing elsewhere? Have other funders already supported them? Looking at their websites, phone numbers. I see a question in the Q&A asking, do funders literally ring those numbers? Yes, that is probably one of the best ways to test the validity of that number. Who do you speak to when that number is answered? Sharing information with other funders, seeking references, having more informal conversations with other funders. Important caveat there about avoiding defamation and just sort of personal gossip about organisations, which isn't appropriate. Financial documentation is part of due diligence and counter fraud, checking accounts, bank statements, governance arrangements. Ask to speak to trustees of a charity that's applied for funding. Have an informal conversation with their chair of trustees. Do they know who their trustees are? Often is a very important sign of legitimacy. Think about your electronic communication. So not just the websites of those you're funding, but increasingly we're seeing instances where funders branding is being used by fraudsters to commit fraud on grant-seeking organisations. So people pretending to be grant funders and asking for bank information. So be very vigilant about those sorts of potential scenarios. Also, I heard an interesting case study recently about expired domain websites. So a funder may have set up a website once, possibly for a project linked to their main website or for a sub entity that they were involved in. And those websites had expired, they've not been renewed, and fraudsters might legally purchase those domain names and then pretend to be representative of those funders or those charities. And lastly, the stage around responding to fraud and escalation. We have guidance in our document about how charitable foundations should go about that, the internal steps they should take, the external steps, which may need to involve the police and regulators via serious incident reporting. So Zara, if you could just move on to the second slide, please, and my final remarks. So I just wanted to mention a few ways in which the context for preventing grant fraud is changing, and particularly this has been accelerated and amplified by the last 18 months, but isn't only because of COVID. This is the direction of travel more generally in the foundation sector. We're seeing across the foundation sector a huge increase in the volume of applicants, 200 or 300% increase in the volume of new applications coming through to foundations. Partly that's about increased need, and partly it's about different kinds of organisations that wouldn't previously have sought funding from charitable foundations. They would normally perhaps have gone through local authorities or from government funding, but where money is getting tighter, it's pushing more organisations to seek funding from foundations. As a consequence of that, there are also a huge proportion of new applicants, applicants unknown to that foundation. As Stuart mentioned in his case study, 2/3 not being known to City Bridge Trust. That's fairly typical we're seeing across the foundation landscape. So funders not holding previous relationships with those organisations. And that can be something to celebrate, like the fact that perhaps more inclusive practice is occurring. There's a wider range of organisations applying for funding, and that is a good thing, but it's also a potential risk. There's also been a sense of speed of decision making in the last 18 months, funders having to work much quicker. That's also been welcomed by grant applicants. The decisions are being made faster. There's not as slow turnaround times for applications. So again, not necessarily something to see as a negative, but something that changes the context of grant fraud prevention. Funders are also, in many cases, feeling emboldened to take risks with the kinds of organisations they fund, wanting to fund more organisations right at the grassroots level, organisations that they haven't previously funded, and organisations that are funding in challenging areas of social policy and society, or outside of the UK. And that does bring additional considerations around fraud prevention. Something else that is a definite trend and will only increase in the years ahead is the funding of non-charities, particularly considering funding of movements, so unconstituted non-entities, and also directly to individuals. This is a growing area of funding practice, and one that is quite fraught with the potential for fraud and other issues that could arise. Funders are going to continue to want to explore opportunities for this, but need to think very hard about how this relates to their due diligence. And lastly, something that's quite particular to the last 18 months and hopefully will start to return to how it was before is a current lack of site visits. It's often a key part of the due diligence process, and actually just one of the best ways for foundations to get to know their grantees. Hasn't been able to happen in the same way for obvious reasons, and presents a set of issues that foundations need to think about. So I'll stop there, Mia, and hand back now to the chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Max, and obviously thanks to Stuart and Emma as well. Some really, really good content there. And I hope everyone on the call found that insightful and interesting. A few little points from me. I think I missed a trick. I should probably put a poll up asking if Stuart is a fraudster, because he's got an AOL web address, and we could have got some feedback from the listeners on that. And Another key point, I think something that Emma mentioned was really interesting around organised crime groups now targeting fraud. It really does happen. When I started in this investigation, well, in the investigation world, I was investigating drug smuggling and that sort of thing. And you have noticed over the last probably 3 or 4 years, even prior to the pandemic, that organised crime is moving into the fraud arena. Main reason being, I think, if you commit an offence under the Fraud Act, maximum prison sentence is 14 years. If you smuggle 100 kilos of crack or cocaine into the UK, you can get life imprisonment. So there's less risk and more reward. And also you don't have other organised crime groups trying to kill you and steal your drugs. So I thought that was a very interesting point from Emma there. We've come right to the end. We've got 1 minute left, which is excellent timing. So again, I would just like to thank you all for joining today. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank our guest speakers, Emma, Stuart and Max, and thank you all for listening. The webinar will be available on demand from the website, which is preventcharityfraud.org.uk. You can also find other useful resources and information there. Thank you very much. Have a nice day and goodbye.